For resources, we looked a little bit on the resource card. And again, I'll not go into all the details or all the different field settings. Most of it is standard. One thing I will mention here is that, as I said earlier, a lot of the setup is actually in this timesheet configuration code. And let's open up this timesheet configuration and see what that includes. Again, it's a lot of different settings. A lot of them are not relevant in most cases. I think a lot of them are self-explanatory. So what is the starting date of the week? There's a rule for time entry. If there's a validation of how many hours you entered, or if you must enter the minimum is the number of hours you have as norm time, or it has to be exactly the number of hours you have as norm time. I think the exact hours is less frequently used. So if you have a 40-hour work week, you must enter exactly 40 hours, no more, no less. So then there's some options to send emails when you get something for approval or when it's not submitted. There's actually multiple options in this area. We can dive into that if that becomes interesting. One of the most important parts is the norm time code. The idea here being that you define different norm time codes for different norm times. So somebody working a 5-day, 40-hour work week, you would set up a code like this, and you would define how many hours that is per day of the week. In this case, 8 hours every day, except Saturday and Sunday. And of course, you could create other codes. If there's somebody only working Monday through Thursday, you could create some with 0 hours on Friday. And so there are different ways to define it. Either you do it as a general rule for everybody, but you can also make exceptions here and say, this is a 40-hour work week, but Cassie, she has a special deal where she works 8 hours every day, but she doesn't work Fridays, but instead she works Saturdays. So that becomes her rule instead. And so you can make these special rules. This can be as complicated or as simple as you would like. The other part is the approval side of it. We'll get to that when we get to timesheet, but for timesheet, you can set to have approval for timesheets, and then you can set, well, it should be project manager approval, or it should be line manager approval, not project manager, or both, or 3 levels of approval, etc. So you define that. And the exact same goes for timesheets. What are the approval rules if we want approval of timesheets? So it's a lot of fields, but that's actually not that much to set up. You usually set it up once and then it's done. And of course, you can have multiple different configurations. So you can have some for admin staff, they have some rules, you have some for management, you have some for the guys in the field, etc. So maybe you have 2, 3, 4 different configurations in here. If you have one line manager, that is the line manager who has to approve. If you have 2 line managers, it's first come who will approve. So either of them can approve. And if you have no line managers and you set it up for line manager approval, it will simply skip that approval step. But there's no difference for 1 or 2. They're exactly on the same level. What's important for the approval process is that it is a layered process. So if you have project manager approval, line manager approval, executive approval, then the project manager must approve first before the line manager sees it. And then the line manager must see it before the executive sees it. And you cannot change that ordering. It has to be in that order. But this is basically it. You should also make sure that resources are part of a resource group, optionally a subgroup. I don't recommend subgroups if you don't really need them, but there's an option to subdivide your resource groups into subgroups for pricing and costing purposes. That, of course, brings us to resource groups. There's not too much to say about resource groups, more than you have different resource groups. And there's not that much to set up on a resource group. If you put in some of these values like general product posting groups or permissions, then they will default onto the resource when you select that resource group on a new resource. There's also a field for billing resource number. That is used if you want to invoice for or create a purchase based on a resource group. So let's say you're subcontracting for an electrician and you created a resource group of electricians. In your budget, you said we need 10 hours of electricians' time, and you put that on the resource group of electricians. Now you want to pull this budget entry into planning, and from that planning, you want to create a purchase order. Then, of course, you cannot create a purchase order line with a line type of resource group, because there is no line type of resource group. So that's why you then have to create a special resource that you'd map it to, and it will create a purchase line for that resource instead. And then you could say, well, but if I have this billing resource anyway, why don't I just budget for that resource? And that's probably what I would recommend anyway. But there is this possibility to have a mapping. Also, if you create quotes, you need that mapping because, again, a quote cannot be based on a resource group. And in that area, it makes a bit more sense because you could have a budget for 100 hours of internal resources. You want to send out a quote based on that, but you cannot create a quote with a line type of resource group, so it must map it over to a resource. It's a bit of a special case, but it's good to know about. It's easy to get stuck in budgeting or planning, and suddenly it's because you're missing that billing resource on the resource group you're quoting for. One thing to be aware of is the resource card, because there are some fields in here which are on the standard resource card, but I don't see here. So you see there are no price fields, there are no cost fields in here. They're all hidden. That is a setup that you need to activate. In resource setup, you can define that you want to hide the base app cost and price fields. You want to hide the standard page actions. Even the same for the resource group. I recommend that to turn these on, because otherwise you get these standard cost and price fields and we don't use them. If you don't turn this on, then you will get to a situation where opening up the resource card, I can see Cassie and I will see some fields for unit cost or unit prices. Oh, I'm going to invoice out Cassie at 120. Perfect. Now that's set. That doesn't do anything at all in the projects area. And though that's why we're hiding it. But if you're also using resources for manufacturing, anything else, you might want to have this. So there's this option to turn them back on, but then be aware that now you have double functionality. We always set the prices in the standard price field in our price lists. And this is also tricky because now I have resource prices here, which is our table, but there's actually a standard action for resource prices as well. And now I'm hiding this, so I'm getting to the right place. But again, if I went back to my resource setup, if I don't hide my page actions here, go for my resources list, open up my resource card, then I suddenly have, oh, here's sales prices. Perfect, I can set my sales prices. Let's create a new price list, but we don't use those prices. So this is a really tricky thing. If you don't turn those off, you suddenly have double functionality and it doesn't work. Well, it works in the right area, but it's something where you can easily get wrong if you don't turn these off. And I think with the demo data set up, it should set these as hidden, but please double check it because it's so easy to think that you're setting up resource prices and actually you're not. Well, you're not setting up resource project prices, but you're setting up standard resource prices. Anyway, for resource pricing and costing, we have cost and prices. You define the cost of a resource either on the resource itself or on the resource group. The way it works is it'll try to find the most specific price. So here for Cassie, I can say, well, her price is 57 per hour. That's her standard cost. This is a cost we will track to the project whenever she spends an hour of time. But if I don't have this, then it'll go back and say, so Cassie is a part of the technicians group. What is the cost of a technician? So it might be easier to define this on the level of resource groups. If you want to look at the complete list of costs and prices, there is from this top menu a complete list of resource costs. And here I can see that again, Cassie, she has a cost of 57, but she's also part of the technicians group. The technicians group was 55. So if I deleted this price, then she would instead fall back to be part of the group. And I generally recommend setting costs on the group level instead of setting individual costs, unless there's a really good reason. In here, there is an alternate option to the standard cost, and that is what we call true labor cost. The true labor cost will try to calculate an hourly cost based on the number of hours you worked in a period of time. Say you have an employee who has a 40-hour work week and they are reporting their time weekly, and their weekly salary is 400, just to say something. Then if they work 40 hours, then of course the hourly cost is 10. But if they happen to work 80 hours, then their cost is less. It's only 5 an hour. And if they're working overtime, maybe they're different rates. So it tries to make a more exact cost out of the salary. I'm not sure that's a good idea. In most cases, I think it's better to go with a standard cost because you get some strange things and you get the idea that you're getting something that is more true. I'm not sure it's that much more true. And it also requires you to kind of align your timesheets with your salary periods, etc. So I would say go with a standard cost. It's easier. And you can also include overheads in that standard cost. There are a few who like this true labor cost if they have employees that work very different hours and have a lot of overtime and so on. You define, if I say this to true labor cost, and then of course you have to also define how do you handle overtime? Do they get extra paid for overtime, etc.? Then you can say how many units of time is there in a time period? And then you have to define that time period. And so I could say, well, they are reporting time with weekly timesheets. So I'll say 40 hours in a period and their weekly salary, because then I'll have to recalculate into weekly and say, well, is making 800 a week, which then basically says now my unit cost is 20. It does this automatic recalculation, but it also then when I submit my weekly timesheet looks at this and says actually this week I worked 80 hours, so my true cost is 10 instead. But I have to do this recalculation. It works reasonably well in areas where you have bi-weekly timesheets and you have bi-weekly payroll. So you can say that there's 80 hours in a period and they submit timesheets on a bi-weekly period, then it works. Otherwise, it just gets messy. It works quite well in the US where everybody works and is paid on a bi-weekly basis. So these are the cost side. You can define that there are special costs for different periods, so you can date control it. You can control it by project and say for a certain project there's a special rate. That usually doesn't make sense for internal resources, but if you're setting up something where you are subcontracting something out and you're using resources for it, you could have a resource for some external electrician and you're saying for this project we have an agreed rate. We're a bit back into the subcontracting, so you can do that and set special rates on that. There are also options for other cost typing where you are adding on to a base cost. So you're layering cost. Again, I really recommend against it because it becomes so hard to figure out what you're really doing. I would say keep it simple for the cost side. Similarly, there's a price side to it. So this is the outbound. And even if you're doing fixed price, this might be relevant to get an idea of how we should set the fixed price, because you will get that information when you budget something and you say, well, we are budgeting for 100 hours of time of technicians. Well, time of technicians, that's 100 an hour. So the price would be 10,000 if we were billing this on a time and material basis. Maybe we set the fixed price to somewhere around 10,000. So you get that information, but the system doesn't actively use it. It's more for information purposes. And so this is a bit for the naming here. We have the different options for pricing. It says fixed price. What we mean by fixed price is that this is a fixed rate. It's not like a fixed price as in a fixed price project. This is the rate instead of having something where it is a percentage and we are adding a percentage on top of the cost. Because we could do that, say, well, we are also always saying it's 70% on top of cost. That is our outbound rate. Again, that makes more sense for contracting. where we say that's the agreement. We charge something on top, either a percentage or a fixed amount. It's always $10 extra an hour for us to handle that invoicing of the subcontracting. But otherwise, we're just rebilling you with some markup on top of it. Again, the fixed is usually easier. And that's basically it. And of course, here you can definitely set prices based on projects, and you can even set it down to the task level, to the level of work type codes, etc. So you can create really detailed price list setups. And all these prices, there's a lot more management into it. Within pricing, I mean, you can create price templates. You can do updating where you do a percentage-wise update. You can then apply those to projects that are using those prices. You can update existing entries that have already created if you're updating prices after the fact, etc. Again, I think we will leave that aside. It's quite big topic, actually, the whole price management. But if you're doing fixed price, everything becomes easier in that area. For resources, there are some special rules for absence or internal work types. We have what we call vacation and flex. The idea being that you can set up a project to track the time people are on vacation or holidays. So special project, special task, and there is an option to then track the balance of time. So you might at the beginning of the year or at some period of time say now you have an additional 25 days of holidays. As people track that time, then we deduct that as well. Yeah, but it doesn't actually require you to have this connection, but you can do it. The other part is for what we call flex, and I don't know if that is of interest. In some areas, they call it toil, the UK at least, where if you're working more than your norm time, then you can get that time off at a later point in time. And so you can have the system either automatically say, if I'm working more than my norm time, set aside a buffer of that time, and then in a later week, I'm allowed to work less, but take from that pool of time. And that can either be a manual process or an automatic process. I'll not show you how to, but if you're interested and it applies, then it's nice to know that it exists. And again, I'll just mention these fantastic permissions that allow you to define if people can see resource costs and prices. Please be careful about them so you don't get into these situations where suddenly the price list is all blank and the values in the project plan are blank. We mentioned that one before.